Again, want to jump right into the panel with some brief introductions. I have Faith Schwartz, CEO and founder of Housing Finance Strategies, Laurie Goodman, fellow at the Urban Institute, and Jim Gray, senior fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And maybe I'll give our audience 15 seconds. It looks like our participant count is going back up to the low hundreds that we had in the fireside chat. And then we'll launch right in. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this morning and afternoon, I guess, for some of us.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thank you.
So jumping right in, and I asked a very similar question in the fireside chat, but I think it's important to kind of set a baseline for what's going on right now. Home prices are up significantly over the past couple of years. Mortgage rates have doubled in the past year. Inventory has been flirting with all-time lows for a decent stretch. I'd love to just go around the horn, and that's a lot of bad news for affordability. What's the good news that's out there when it comes to affordability? And I'll start with Faith.
Well, on this one, I think clearly we have big effort by the government, more than we've ever seen before, making this squarely a top priority for the administration, which puts a lot of force and power into HUD, Ginnie Mae, FHA, and the government to help the industry move forward. The federal level can't do a lot, and I know Laurie's going to speak a little bit about the doubling of house prices and what that really does to the accessibility of credit for borrowers who otherwise have good incomes and means, but they have no down payments and access to get into these houses. So I'll speak a little more on the government ideas around affordable housing, but I know Laurie had some comments earlier on this.
Thank you. So, yes, home prices are up 40 to 50% over the last couple of years taken as a whole, but they're actually down the last 6 months or so. Interest rates hit a high of around 7%, and they've come down. Inventory levels have bottomed. Yes, they are low in any sort of a reasonable historical framework. But it's important to realize, I think affordability has gotten as bad as we're going to see, because wages are also up a fair amount. And I would expect that, what we've seen is that wage is with home prices down a little bit at the same time that wage growth is up. Wage growth is way outpaced home price appreciation. And even if you think that home prices are going to be flat over the course of 2023, which is sort of at the optimistic end of people's ranges, wages and salaries are going to continue to grow. So I think we've seen the worst in terms of affordability. I'd expect wage growth to considerably outpace HPA over the next year, which is going to bring affordability more into line. And now let's talk briefly about interest rates. Yes, we've had huge increases in interest rates over the past year, but it's important to realize, but we don't know whether the Fed clearly has more to go. The question is how much more to go. But it's also important to realize that mortgage spreads are unusually wide, and mortgage rates are determined by the 10-year Treasury rate plus mortgage spreads. So it's very possible that you actually have 10-year rates rise a little bit and spreads contract to more normal levels, and mortgage rates actually fall over the course of the next year. So I guess my base would be wages continue to rise and outpace HPA. At the same time, mortgage spreads contract to more typical levels, and mortgage rates either go down or stay the same. So, I actually think we've seen the worst in terms of affordability.
I like what you have to say, Laurie. We might need to get you to write a forecast for us for 2023. We've had a forecast series that we've been doing, and that is actually quite a bit of positive news. Jim, what are you seeing in terms of good news out there with affordability?
Yeah. So that's the part I wanted to pick up on, Diego, because I agree with Faith that the change in the administration is hugely good news. To have people with the understanding of the markets and the mission orientation of Julia Goodman and Elena McCargo and the roles that they're in just makes all the difference. And I think people are starting to see that there really is a lot more that can be done when you can just even minimally make changes in the credit box that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have so much power over. And the biggest challenge is helping people understand that the kinds of things that we're ordinarily talking about in affordable housing have no connection to the 2008 foreclosure crisis, right? There are so many opportunities to make small changes to reach markets that are maybe a little less profitable for Fannie and Freddie, but are plenty credit worthy. And so that's some of the work that we're trying to do in this new Underserved Mortgage Markets Coalition.
That's great. And I'll just remind our audience that if you have a question for our panelists, please feel free to drop it in to the Q&A section by clicking the Q&A button, or by dropping it into the chat section by clicking the chat button. We're happy to go off road a little bit with an interesting audience question. So back to Faith for this second question. We talked a little bit about government and good news, but what do you think that government can do to create more good news on affordable housing? And are there any public-private partnerships that could be useful here?
Yeah, I think one thing I feel like we now always go back to is we always lean on the government for so much. And of course, we're grateful they offer pure liquidity and a dominant source of liquidity for the first lien market. But they're also very influential. So innovation outside of the government, as Laurie noted, spreads have been wide, difficult to get private capital in easily in this market. One thing I think we need to dust off is programs. Underwriting guidelines, first and second lien liquidity, combinations of private sector and public dollars or government dollars, so that we step back and say, what can we do? Laurie's right, prices are stabilizing. They're coming down a little bit, but guess what? Housing is very expensive. People might have incomes, they don't have generational wealth. A lot don't have that. And down payment assistance and access to homeownership is very difficult for people that don't have means and don't have generational wealth. And that's, of course, driving all the other issues like special credit purpose vehicles and generational wealth legislation that never passes. So I think we have to step back and say the government is dominant. So they are not the ones who have to make that difference and provide liquidity. But private capital should be brought in at reasonable returns with guardrails to protect the consumer and help us execute on some innovative programs, underwriting, trended data, utilities. You can bring in things. And while we're scratching the surface, it's not materially changing things. But all these little additions, as Jim pointed out, really can make a substantial difference for the gap of 30 points to people of color who don't have homeownership.
Jim, I'd love to get your thoughts there. Anything to add to what Faith just said?
No, I think Faith said it well. I'll go just a little deeper. One of the things that gets talked about a lot is the equitable housing finance plans that FHFA instituted last summer. While in general, that's a great idea and we're all for it, the lack of structure in that program, say compared to duty to serve, is a real hindrance. There's no standards for what's an effective plan. How will the enterprises be evaluated on whether they did what they said or not? How will any of this be reported? We really feel like it's important that FHFA come up with a regulation or some way to make that program have greater accountability.
Laurie, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I
agree with everything that Faith and Jim said. And rather than repeat what they just said so eloquently, I'm going to add 2 more points. So first, we definitely need to broaden the credit box. And there are sort of 2 ways we can do that. One is to hold the probability of default constant and incorporate things like telecom and utility payments, rental payments to qualify more borrowers with the constant probability of default. The second thing we can do is recognize the fact that there have been huge improvements in the loss mitigation toolkit. So maybe we could maybe we could widen what we thought was the proper probability of default that we as a society are prepared to tolerate. Maybe we can widen that a little bit and get a lot more borrowers, and a higher proportion of those are going to be borrowers of color doing it that way. So I actually think that the second could be very, very impactful, and nobody is really talking about it. The second thing is to create good news on affordable housing. I think we really need to focus on supply. You know, ultimately, we've got less housing, we've got more demand for housing than we do housing units. And the question is how to equate that. So, you know, obviously the government has taken some steps. They've made the long-term housing tax credit a little bit more flexible, things like that. But I think there's a lot more that can be done, in particular in terms of improving ADU financing. Renovation financing is extremely cumbersome. You need a well-functioning chattel finance system, and condo construction, which is the most affordable form of, which is a very affordable form of housing, is historically low, whether you measure it as a percent of multifamily construction, that is sales plus rental construction, or as a percentage of total construction for sale, that is single family plus multifamily for sale. And a lot of that reflects the fact that federal financing is very tight for condos, and state and local defect laws are very stringent. So perhaps we should look at that as well.
So the audience questions are starting to roll in, and I want to go over to one of these because I think it's a really good one. The question asks, do you think programs will increase the income limits for affordable programs given inflation? And this, I think it's a loan officer. They're having a very hard time getting borrowers into these programs because they are over the income limit. So what do we need to do here? Inflation has been running a little bit wild over the past year and a half or so. What do we need to do to change these programs to reflect that inflation? Anyone can jump in.
I'm happy to just make a comment on this. I was recently at a roundtable on who's accessible to down payment assistance programs by the government, which, as you know, could be 80% median income or lower. And some people in the roundtable in Reno, Nevada, led by the Federal Home Loan Bank system, talked about programs that they're rolling out that are 140 to 150% of median income, because it's capturing more people that still have no down payment, have good incomes, but they're in very expensive housing and can really use help to get into ownership versus rental. So there was a lot of chatter with a lot of advocates and housing groups that we have to reflect the reality of the market and who should be in home ownership. And there's a real missing middle on that. So I thought that was just an interesting bit of feedback. I think the MBA's looking hard at raising those limits just through one of their programs, through their convergence program that they're working on. So I think we're going to hear more and more that we need to raise that limit.
Yeah, I was going to chime in that I think it's sort of interesting that on some of the LLPA price changes, a lot of the limits are now applicable up to 100 AMI, and in high cost areas 120 in terms of the LLPA waivers in some cases. So I thought that was an interesting development.
And I'll ask some of the folks working behind the scenes to maybe track down a little bit more information on LLPA and the recent changes. It's pretty detailed, so important for folks to understand what's going on there, and we'll try to track down some information. We're already plugging some white papers and research from our panelists, different organizations in the chat. So definitely check out the chat box for that additional thought leadership. Okay, so we're going to stay off road with audience questions. Is there anything specific being done to help with affordable housing for seniors? This is an important one. Senior housing is a challenge across the country. And so again, I'll open it up to everyone anyone who has thoughts, please jump in.
I was just going to say, so for most seniors, most seniors actually want to age in place. And what we actually, and sort of trip and fall accidents are a huge issue. Very few seniors have their houses sort of fit for this stage of their life. And it could be very, there's been papers showing that it could be very cost effective to have Medicare in particular pay for grab bars so you don't trip on the shower and sort of toilet seat extenders. I mean, there are certain things that you can do very cheaply and very easily, assuming people want to age in place. I think accessory dwelling units are another thing where sort of expanding the financing, eliminating zoning laws could actually make it more comfortable for seniors to age in place, because they can have someone who is who's in a different unit but is actually with them a lot of the time.
So, Jim, I'd love for you to dive a little bit more into some of the repercussions, maybe positive and negative, of the administration change that we experienced recently. It seems like housing is a big focus for new leadership of the various agencies. Yeah, I'd love for you to give us your insights there.
Well, I'll just start with the most recent thing from last week, which is the bringing back affirmatively furthering fair housing, which will do a lot to help communities plan and make more affordable housing available at the local level. So that's a huge thing. Certainly, I think we're probably going to get into manufactured housing more a little later, but the president's statement from was it roughly May of last year was really unprecedented. I don't know of any president in my lifetime who has made such an effort in affordable housing, and manufactured housing and ADUs both featured prominently in that. The fact that Sandra Thompson is now at the helm at FHFA and is taking much more seriously than her predecessor the affordable housing responsibilities that Fannie and Freddie have is another thing. The work that Julia Gordon and her team have done along with Jenny May on trying to get to Title I. I mean, there's a pretty long list of impressive achievements that this administration can already point to, and they're just 2 years in.
Yeah, I mean, for us as a media organization, the collaboration has definitely been there, including folks pretty high up in the administration and at these agencies coming to talk to our audiences at various live events. That's been a breath of fresh air for sure. Faith and Laurie, anything to add on this topic?
So I actually want to pick up. I wanted to actually pick up the themes that Jim stressed on manufactured housing and ADUs. I think this alternative supply can help a lot. And I just want to give some sense of the numbers. So in manufactured housing, we were producing 240,000 units. We're shipping basically 240,000 units a year from 1977 to 1994. In 2022, there was a smidge over 100,000 units shipped. So in a growing population, the most affordable form of housing, units are way down from when I was a kid growing up in the 70s. And even if we went halfway in between these numbers, we'd still have an additional 70,000 units per year. That, in terms of ADU, it's the single most important potential source of supply. There's about 1.4 million ADUs and 85.6 million detached single-family homes in the U.S. So 1.6% of all homes have an ADU. Increasing the share to 3% over 5 years could create an additional 1.2 million ADUs, or about 233,000 a year. So wow. Increasing MH plus ADUs could produce an extra 300,000 units of housing per year. Last year, we completed about 1.5 million units, single family plus multifamily plus manufactured housing, which was the most since 2007. So 300,000 units a year would represent basically a 20% increase over last year's level. So I mean, I want to sort of get a sense that these aren't just niche products. These are really, really important products, and there's lots of room for improvement.
In the fireside chat I was just in, Michelle Boyd of the Turner Housing Center talked a lot about ADUs, specifically in California, and it sounds like the regulatory environment for ADUs has gotten much better, at least in that state. Do we think that's going to spread across the rest of the country to make ADUs even more prominent in our supply?
I mean, you're seeing it in other areas of the country as well. I mean, there are a lot of other areas that there, the city of Minneapolis, Austin, have adopted, a number of other states have adopted ADU rules eliminating ADU restrictions on the zoning side, and there's an increasing tendency toward this. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of making sure the financing works and basically giving people blueprints for sort of standardized structures so each one doesn't cost a fortune.
Yeah, I just would jump in. I think it gets back to liquidity first, second lien, and or options for equity, whatever that might look like with the government, with the private sector. I just heard a startling fact that was shared by one of the Fannie Mae researchers, that we would need 4.4 million loans to be made to people of color, African Americans, to close that ownership gap. So you've got supply, you've got products and innovation for people who already have income and a means and a desire to own. We have a long way to go, and so my view is we have an amazing set of leaders right now in the government. I'm worried about the scale and the execution of taking off and having it with so much energy put here. We haven't seen that before. We won't see it again, not quite the same way. Yeah. And so we have to take advantage of this opportunity. It's year 3 of this administration, and look hard at the current policies, the AML, the product innovation, the credit, and maybe do some more piloting, because we don't have scalable solutions that are making a big difference yet, in my mind. I think we have a little ways to go on that, and I think this is the year to get it on steroids.
So, Diego, if I could pick up where Faith left off, particularly with manufactured housing. So at Lincoln, we've taken over the Innovations in Manufactured Housing, or I'm Home network, and we're focusing on 4 issues that we think are most critical to really unlocking the potential for manufactured housing. Of course, financing that we've already talked about, and Laurie referred to the need to have chattel financing. A second one is the land issues. We see so much in the media about private equity acquiring this very important resource of manufactured housing parks, that not many new ones like that are being created. And so figuring out ways to get those into the hands of the residents when possible, or to at least keep them out of the hands of predatory investors. And then another issue that's come up a couple of times, but really applies especially to manufactured housing, is exclusionary zoning. So many communities have explicit prohibitions on manufactured housing, even as the quality of units now coming off the line are virtually indistinguishable from site-built homes in a lot of cases. So that needs to be addressed. And then finally, the quality and energy efficiency issues. So we need to be sure that when we're putting families into manufactured housing, that it's an energy efficient unit that will retain its affordability to operate, not just be cheap to buy.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the supply side, which is really important, obviously a very important part of the affordability equation. There's also the demand side, and there's some interesting things happening with alternative ownership models like rent to own. And this will probably be our final question. The time really flies when we're having fun like this. But I'd love to get the panel to weigh in on these alternative ownership models, and I'll start with Jim.
Oh boy! So this is maybe a good one to end on. This is one issue that we may not all see eye to eye. based on conversations we've had before. So at the Lincoln Institute, we're big believers in housing with affordability that lasts, as opposed to some of the more faddish shared appreciation models that are very popular, certainly with some investors who want to make a profit by helping people get into ownership. We're concerned about when that might contribute to overheating a market. We realize we have to try lots of things, but when it comes to those sorts of models, we want to proceed very cautiously. And maybe I should give my co-panelists a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, let's close it out with some.
He means me.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I don't think you know many people that care about consumer protection as much as I do in this market. So let's set the stage. Generational wealth is not there, and access to home ownership is not there with a vast majority of people who aren't in homes today. So there are private sector options, capital chasing this market. Lots already very active, more on the taking equity out or refinance side. What I've been referring to is somewhat of a slightly different model that is less of, it's a subsidized return. It's not the Wall Street returns, it's a CDFI return, where you might say, I can give you up to 25% down payment. You put 5 or 10% payment down, which is what you've saved for 10 years or 5 years. And then you have a mortgage where you can move out of a rough part of renting in a city to a more desirable part of the city that you stay in place. But your mortgage is, 65% of the value of the house versus the whole thing. I don't know. It's not for everyone. I totally agree with you, Jim. But we should not be shutting the door on old kind of reputations, and we've got to step back and really assess what could work for the right borrowers. And it's maybe not good for a third of them, or maybe it's good for a few, but to not bring in private capital and keep leaning on government DPA, down payment assistance, that's not widely known, leveraged or scaled across the business in any meaningful way, not really. I think we're back in the same traps that we've been in. So whether it's this product or something else, we've got to keep working toward, with all this focus and energy, we can put the guardrails in place to make it borrower protected and a good path for all players. It's tricky, but I just don't think we should be shutting doors on that.
I'm going to let that be oh yeah, go ahead, Laurie.
Yeah, so I'm actually, I agree with what Faith said. I'm actually a huge fan of rent to own done right. I think it has a ton of potential. It sort of gives renters a chance to build their credit history. What do I mean done right? Where the renter has the option, but not the obligation to buy at a certain price within a certain period. And the renter may be paying a little bit of an option premium that is in the form of a little more in rent for the option, but basically they have the option, but not the obligation to buy. And I think that's rent to own done right. And that I think there's a ton of potential in. For shared equity, I think there is a minority of borrowers that it works for, without some sort of subsidization. The capital markets trade-off is if the investor puts in 10%, they get 25% of the upside. That's sort of the typical market return on it. I think, for most borrowers, they're better off putting down more, getting an FHA mortgage. The payment would be a little bit higher, but they're better off with that arrangement because they get to keep all of their equity, and over time, you will build wealth through home ownership. There's a small subset of the market for which shared equity makes sense. And I should mention that shared equity actually doesn't need to just be a purchase tool. It could also, it might be a way to do debt consolidation as well. And there I'm actually more positive on the shared equity model than I am as a purchase vehicle.
So I'm going to let that be the final word. We are at the end, but I'm going to commit to exploring this topic more, and also alternative supply in a part 2 of this event. I think there's a lot for us to talk about, as we can see, and maybe we'll have all 3 of you back to dive in even more detail. Thank you so much for your time
Thank
today.
you.
It was a pleasure
Thank you.
talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.